Hello. First. I'll wait a few minutes before we start so people can arrive. Whew. I ran out of whiskey yesterday, so we're having a beer night. When I started these things, I thought it was just going to be tea. Um, tea every stream, but it turns out that the more I do it, the more. Uh, oh no, Pippa is here, but she can't type. Well, oh, okay. Well, that's okay. We know you're here, Pippa. Um, you approve of my beer choice? Oh, you're here. Hey. He is not so bad, Sophie. Depends on like the kind you get. My whiskey choices were questionable. Well, it tastes like cinnamon. I don't know what you want for me. Good. All beer is bad. I don't think I can agree with that. It's maybe not my favorite or preferred alcohol, but Fireball. Well, what do I have now? Mirrored, but see what it is. Um, like softest tasting of beers. And usually, like, I mix my Fireball with like cider and stuff. Okay, we should start now. Like, yeah. Okay. So on Wednesday, we read chapters 5 and 6. Um, Basically, Sophie had broken into the castle. Howl had sort of accepted her as the cleaning lady. He mostly ignored her. Um, and she just went about her business. Howl was in a bit of a funk espresso because the girl wasn't paying attention to him. He had his tantrum, like iconic from the film. Um, the what's the line? The life life isn't worth living if I'm not beautiful. That line isn't in the book. Still iconic. Um, and then we found out that Hal is trying to pursue Sophie's sister Letty. So that is where we left off. And now we are on to chapter 7. She used a classically overlooked profession to be genuinely destructive. She did. She, she did. Um, she did a great job. Hal had a proper fit. Um, his hair was like slightly tinged red. Try. Oh, by the way, I didn't show you guys last time, but my bookmark is a um Sophie got me. Like attached this little bit to it. Work. Nope. Clearly, I am not a influencer. You made it. Yes, she made it. Okay, so chapter 7, in which a scarecrow prevents Sophie from leaving the castle. Only a particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market shipping that evening, but the drizzle in Port Haven had got into her bones. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It might not be so bad, she thought. She only had to tell Martha that the suitor she was not sure about was none other than the wizard Howl. That would scare Martha off. And she would tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him, and then perhaps to threaten him with aunts. Sophie was still creaking when she got up the next morning. Curse the witch of the waste, she muttered to Dick as she got ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom. He had never had a tantrum in his life. She tiptoed to the door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. Sophie looked at him sourly. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his grey and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. I think my hair looks rather good this colour, he said. Do you indeed? Grumped Sophie. It goes with the suit, said Howl. You have quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given the suit more style somehow. Ha, said Sophie. Howl stepped with his hand on the knob above the door. Aches and pains troubling you? He said. Has something annoyed you? Annoyed? Said Sophie. Why would I be annoyed? Someone only filled the castle with rotten aspic and deafened everyone in Port Haven and scared Calcifer to a cinder and broke a few hundred hearts. Why should that annoy me? Hal laughed. I apologize, he said, turning the knob to red down. The king wants to see me today. I shall probably be kicking my heels in the palace until evening, but I can do something for your rheumatism when I get back. Don't forget to tell Michael I left that spell for him on the bench. He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires of Kingsbury. And you think that makes it all right? Sophie growled as the door shut. But the smile had mollified her. That smile works on me. Then it's no wonder poor Martha doesn't know her own mind, he muttered. I need another log before you go, Calcifer reminded her. Sophie hobbled to drop another log into the grate. Then she set off to the door again. But here, Michael came running downstairs and snatched the remains of a loaf off the bench as he ran to the door. You don't mind, do you? He said in an agitated way. I'll bring a fresh loaf when I come back. I've got something very urgent to see to today, but I'll be back by evening. If the sea captain calls for his wind spell, it's on the end of the bench, clearly labelled. He turned the doorknob green downward and jumped out the windy hillside, loaf clutched to his stomach. See you, he shouted as the castle trundled away past him and the doors slammed. Sorry, be a break. Um, you're 30 seconds behind? Oh, that's okay. I mean, at least it's not like cutting out. And hey, Black Parrot, thank you for joining us. Okay. Botheration, said Sophie. Calcifer, how does a person open the door when there's no one inside the castle? I'll open it for you. Or Michael. Hal does it himself, said. So no one would be locked out when Sophie left. She was not at all sure she would be coming back, but she did not intend to tell Calcifer. She gave Michael time to get well on the way to wherever he was going and set off for the door again. This time, Calcifer stopped her. If you're going to be away long, he said, you might leave some logs where I can reach them. Can you pick up logs? Sophie asked, intrigued in spite of her impatience. For answer, Calcifer stretched out a blue arm-shaped flame divided into green finger-like flames at the end. It was not very long, nor did it look strong. See, I can almost reach the hearth. Sophie stacked a pile of logs in front of the grate so that Calcifer could at least reach the top one. You're not to burn them until you've got them in the grate, she warned him. She set off for the door yet again. This time, somebody knocked on it before she got there. It was one of those days, Sophie. It must be the sea captain. She put up her hand to turn the knob blue down. No, it's the castle door. Oh, I said castle again. Today, Pippa roasted me because I didn't say castle like I usually do. Castle. Now it's like in my brain. But every time I read it, I'm like, my brain is saying castle because of you, Pippa. Anyway, no, it's the castle door, Pulsifer said, but I'm not sure. Then it was Michael back for some reason, Sophie thought as she opened the door. A turnip face leered at her. She smelled mildew. Against the wide blue sky, a ragged arm ending in the stump of a stick wheeled round and tried to paw at her. It was a scarecrow. It was only made of sticks and rags, but it was alive, and it was trying to come in. Pulsifer, Sophie screamed. Make the castle go faster. Stone blocks round the doorway crunched and grated. The green-brown moorland was suddenly rushing past. The scarecrow's stick arm thumped on the door and then went scraping along the wall of the castle as the castle left it behind. It wheeled its other arm round and seemed to try to clutch at the stonework. It meant to get into the castle if it could. Sophie slammed the door shut. This, she thought, just showed how stupid it was for an eldest child to try to seek her fortune. That was the scarecrow she had propped in the hedge on her way to the castle. He had made jokes to it. Now, as if her jokes had brought it to evil life, it had followed her all the way here and tried to paw at her face. She ran to the window to see if the thing was still trying to get into the castle. Of course, all she could see was a sunny day in Porthaven, with a dozen sails going up a dozen masts beyond the roofs opposite, and a cloud of seagulls circling in the blue sky. That's the difficulty of being in several places at once, Sophie said to the human skull on the bench. Then all at once, she discovered the real drawback to being an old woman. Her heart gave a leap and a little stutter, and then seemed to be trying to bang its way out of her chest. It hurt. She shook all over and her knees trembled. She rather thought she might be dying. It was all she could do to get to the chair by the hearth. She sat there panting, clutching her. Is something the matter? Pulsifer asked. Yes, my heart. There was a scarecrow at the door, Sophie gasped. What has a scarecrow to do with your heart? Pulsifer asked. It was trying to get in here. It gave me a terrible fright. And my heart. But you wouldn't understand, you silly young demon, Sophie panted. You haven't got a heart. Yes, I have, Pulsifer said as proudly as he had revealed his arm. Down in the glowing part under the logs. And don't call me young. I'm a good million years older than you are. Can I reduce the speed of the castle now? Only if the scarecrow's gone, said Sophie. Has it? I can't tell, said. It's not flesh and blood, you see. I told you, I couldn't really see outside. Sophie got up and dragged herself to the door again, feeling ill. She opened it slowly and cautiously. Green steepness, rocks, and purple slope whirled past, making her feel dizzy. But she took a grip on the doorframe and leaned out to look along the wall to the moorland they were leaving behind. The scarecrow was about 50 yards to the rear. It was hopping from clump to heather clump, with a sinister sort of valiance, holding its fluttering stick arms at an angle to balance it on the hillside. Sophie watched. The castle left it further behind. It was slow, but it was still following. She shut the door. It's still there, she said, hopping after us. Go faster. But that upsets all my calculations. I was aiming to circle the hills and get back to where Michael left us in time to pick him up this evening. Then go twice as fast and circle the hills twice. As long as you leave that horrible thing behind, said Sophie. What a fuss, Calcifer. But he increased the castle's speed. Sophie could actually, for the first time, feel it rumbling around her. She sat huddled in her chair, wondering if she was dying. She did not want to die yet, before she had talked to Martha. As the day went on, everything in the castle began to jiggle with its speed. Bottles clinked. The skull clattered on the bench. Sophie could hear things falling off the shelf in the bathroom and splashing into the bath where Hal's blue and silver suit was still soaking. She began to feel a little better. She dragged herself to the door again and looked out with her hair flying in the wind. The ground was streaking past underneath. The The hills seemed to be spinning slowly as the castle sped across them. The grinding and rumbling nearly deafened her, and smoke was puffing out behind in blasts. But the scarecrow was a tiny black dot on a distant slope by then. Next time she looked, it was out of sight entirely. Good, then I shall stop for the night, said Calcifer. That was quite a strain. The rumbling died away. Things stopped jiggling. Calcifer went to sleep in the way fires do, thinking among the logs until there were rosy cylinders plated with white ash, with only a hint of blue and green deep underneath. Sophie felt quite spry again by then. She went and fished 6 packets and a bottle out of the slimy water in the bath. The packets were soaked. She did not dare leave them that way after yesterday. So she laid them on the floor and very cautiously sprinkled them with the stuff labeled drying powder. They were dry almost instantly. This was encouraging. Sophie let the water out of the bath and tried the powder on Howl's suit. That dried too. It was still stained green and rather smaller than it, but it cheered Sophie up to find she could put at least something right. Break again. What a warm voice. Oh, that's nice. I hope it's comforting. She felt cheerful enough to busy herself getting supper. She bundled everything on the bench into a heap round the skull at one end and began chopping onions. At least your eyes don't water, my friend, she told the skull. Count your blessings. The door sprang open. Sophie nearly cut herself in her fright, thinking it was the scarecrow again. But it was Michael. He burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie, and a pink and white striped box on top of the onions. Then he seized Sophie round her skinny waist and danced her round the room. It's all right, he shouted joyfully. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. Steady, steady, she gasped, giddily, trying to hold the knife where it would not cut either of them. What is all right? Letty loves me, Michael shouted, dancing her almost into the bathroom and then almost into the hearth. She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake. He spun them both round in the middle of the room. Will you let me go before this knife cuts one of us? Sophie squawked, and perhaps explain a little. We up, Michael shouted. Weird way to shout. He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her into it, where she sat gasping. Last night, I wish you'd dyed his hair blue, he said. I don't mind now. When Howl said Letty Hatter, I even thought of dyeing him blue myself. You can see the way he talks. I knew he was going to drop this girl, just like all the others, as soon as he'd got her to love him. And when I thought it was my Letty, anyway, he said there was another fellow, and I thought that was me. So I tore down to market chipping today, and it was all right. Hal must be after some other girl with the same name. Letty's never even seen him. Let's get this straight, Sophie said dizzily. We are talking about the Letty Hatter who works in Cesari's pastry shop, are we? Of course we are, Michael said jubilantly. I've loved her ever since she started work there, and I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't have been surprised if Hal was one of them. I'm so relieved. I got you a cake from Cesari's to celebrate. Where did I put it? Oh, here it is. He thrust the pink and white box at Sophie. Onion fell off it into her lap. How old are you, my child? Sophie asked. 15 last May Day, said Michael. Calcifer sent fireworks up from the castle. Didn't you, Calcifer? Oh, he's asleep. You're probably thinking I'm too young to be engaged. I've still got 3 years of my apprenticeship. And Letty's got even longer. But we promised one another, and we don't mind waiting. Excuse me? What is this? This is absurd. Australia? Uh, no, I live in the city. So we're safe. We're safe from Huntsman at the moment. Um, we keep the huntsman to control. Elder abuse, yeah, but like I'm just shook that like Michael wants to get married. He is 15. This is some Little Mermaid like stuff. Uh, PG-13 stream. Don't have the M rating on. I'm not allowed to swear. Okay, back to Michael. Then Michael was about the right age for Martha, Sophie thought, and she knew by now he was a nice, steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Bless Martha's heart. When she thought back to that bewildering May Day, she realized that Michael had been one of that shouting group leaning on the counter in front of Martha, but Howl had been outside in Market Square. Are you sure your Letty was telling the truth about Howl? He asked anxiously. Positive, said Michael. I know when she's lying. She stops twiddling her thumbs. She does too, said Sophie, chuckling. How do you know? Michael asked in surprise. Because she's my sister's granddaughter, said Sophie. And as a small girl, she was not always terribly truthful. But she's quite young and, well, suppose she changes as she grows. She, may not look quite the same in a year or so. Neither will I, said Michael. People our age change all the time. It won't worry us. She'll still be Letty, in a manner of speaking. But suppose she was telling the truth, he went on anxiously, and she just knew Hal under a false name. Don't worry, I thought of that, said Michael. I described Hal. You must admit, he's pretty recognizable. And she really hadn't seen him, or his wretched guitar. I didn't even have to tell her he doesn't know how to play the thing. She never set eyes on him, and she twiddled her thumbs all the time, said she hadn't. That's relief, Sophie said, lying stiffly back in her chair. And it certainly was a relief about Martha, but it was not much of a relief, because Sophie was positive that the only other Letty Hatter in the district was the real one. If there had been another, someone would have come into the hat shop and gossiped about it. It sounded like strong-minded Letty not giving in to Hal. What worried Sophie was that Letty had told Hal her real name. She might not be sure about him, but she liked him enough to trust him with an important secret like that. Don't look so anxious, Michael laughed, leaning on the back of the chair. Have a look at the cake I bought you. As Sophie started opening the box, it dawned on her that Michael had gone from seeing her as a natural disaster to actually liking her. She was so pleased and grateful that she decided to tell Michael the whole truth about Letty and Martha and herself too. It was only fair to let him know the sort of family he meant to marry into. The box came open. It was Cesari's most luscious cake, covered in cream and cherries and little curls of chocolate. Oh, said Sophie. The square knob over the door clicked round to red blob down of its own accord. Hal came in. What a marvellous cake! My favourite kind, he said. Where did you get it? I called in at Cesari's, Michael said in a sheepish, self-conscious way. Sophie looked up at Hal. Something was always going to interrupt her when she decided to say she was under a spell. Even a wizard, it seemed. It looks worth the walk, Hal said, inspecting the cake. I've heard Cesari's is better than any of the cake shops in Kingsbury. Stupid of me never to have been in the place. And is that a pie I see on the bench? He went over to look. Pie in a bed of raw onions. Human skull looking put upon. He picked up the skull and knocked an onion ring out of its eye socket. I see Sophie has been busy again. Couldn't you have restrained her, my friend? The skull yattered its teeth at him. Hal looked startled and put it down rather hastily. Is something the matter? Michael asked. He seemed to know the signs. There is, said Hal. I shall have to find someone to blacken my name to the king. Was there something wrong with the wagon spell? Said Michael. No, it worked perfectly. That's the trouble, Hal said restlessly, twiddling an onion ring on one finger. The king's trying to pin me down to do something else now. Calcifer, if we're not very careful, he's going to appoint me royal magician. Calcifer did not answer. Hal roved back to the fireside, realized Calcifer. Wake him up, Michael. I need to consult him. Michael threw 2 logs on Calcifer and called him. Nothing happened apart from a thin spire of smoke. Calcifer, Hal shouted. That did no good either. Hal gave Michael a mystified look and picked up the poker, which was something Sophie had never seen him do before. Sorry, Calcifer, he said, dabbing under the unburned logs. Wake up! One thick black cloud of smoke rolled up and stopped. Go away, Calcifer. Tired. At this, Hal looked thoroughly alarmed. What's wrong with him? I've never known him like this before. I think it was the scarecrow, Sophie said. Hal swiveled round on his knees and levelled his glass marble eyes at her. What have you done now? He went on staring while Sophie explained. A scarecrow, he said. Calcifer agreed to speed up the castle because of a scarecrow. Yes, Sophie, do please tell me how you bully a fire demon into being that obliging. I'd dearly love to know. I didn't bully him, said Sophie. It gave me a turn and he was sorry for me. It gave her a turn and Calcifer was sorry for her, Hal repeated. My good Sophie, Calcifer is never sorry for anyone. Anyway, I hope you enjoy raw onions and cold pie for your supper, because you've almost put Calcifer out. There's the cake, Michael said, trying to make peace. The food did seem to improve Hal's temper, although he kept casting anxious looks at unburning logs in the hearth all the time they were eating. The pie was good cold, and the onions were quite tasty. Sophie had soaked them in vinegar. Cake was superb. While they were eating it, Michael risked asking Hal what the king had wanted. Nothing definite yet, Hal said gloomily. He was sounding me out about his brother quite ominously. Apparently, they had a good old argument before Prince Justin stormed off and people are talking. The king obviously wanted me to volunteer to look for his brother, and like a fool, I went and said I didn't think Wizard Solomon was dead, and that made matters worse. Why do you want to slither out of looking for the prince? Sophie demanded. Don't you think you can find him? Rude as well as a bully, aren't you? Hal said. He had still not forgiven her about Calcifer. I want to get out of it because I know I can find him. If you must know, Justin was great buddies with Solomon, and the argument was because he told the king he was going to look for him. He didn't think the king should have sent Solomon to the waste in the first place. Now even you must know there is a certain lady in the waste who is very bad news. She promised to fry me alive last year. She sent a curse out after me. I've only avoided so far because I had the sense to give her a false name. Sophie was almost awed. You mean you jilted the witch of the waste? Hal cut himself another lump of cake, looking sad and honourable. That is not the way to put it. I admit, I thought I was fond of her for a time. She is in some ways a very sad lady, very unloved. Every man in Ingery is scared stiff of her. You ought to know how that feels, Sophie dear. Sophie's mouth opened in utter indignation. Michael said quickly, Do you think we should move the castle? That's why you invented it, wasn't it? That depends on Calcifer. Hal looked over his shoulder at the barely smoking logs again. I must say, if I think of the king and the witch both after me, I get a craving for planting the castle on a nice frowning rock 1,000 miles away. Michael obviously wished he had not spoken. Sophie could see he was thinking that 1,000 miles was a terribly long way from Martha. But what happens to your Letty Hatter? She said to Hal. If you up and move now. I expect that will be all over by then, Hal said absently. But if I could only think of a way to get the king off my back. I know. He lifted his fork with a melting hunk of cream cake on it and pointed it at Sophie. You can blacken my name to the king. You can pretend to be my old mother and plead for your blue-eyed boy. He gave Sophie the smile which had no doubt charmed the witch of the waste, and possibly Letty too, firing it along the fork, across the cream, straight into Sophie's eyes dazzlingly. If you can bully Calcifer, the king should give you no trouble at all. Sophie stared through the dazzle and said nothing. This, she thought, was where she slithered out. She was leaving. It was too bad about Calcifer's contract. She'd had enough of Howl, first green slime, then glaring at her for something Calcifer had done quite freely, And now this. Tomorrow, he would slip up off to upper folding and tell Letty all about it. Okay, I need to move. Ugh. We moved back to my room because the living room situation was bad with lighting and stuff, but doing this in here is not great for my back or my knees. Oof. Oof, knees. Okay. 1 second, I'm just gonna check in with the chat. Um, he is a child. What's a redback? You've never heard of a redback grizzled in my pants? What a name. It's a spider. It is a spider you should be very careful. I think whitetails are scarier though. Proper spider indeed. I feel you almost said Magnus there. When? I might have. I do have Magnus on the mind, like almost constantly, which I'm sure most people know in this chat. And if you don't, go listen to the Magnus arc. A whitetail is also a spider. And I'm not 100% certain if this is true, but I got told often as a kid that if a whitetail bites you, that your skin can start flaking away and lose your limb. I don't know if it's true though. I never researched. It's always a spider in Australia. Okay. We are up to chapter 8. More common than our drop bears. Drop bears were like when you'd go on camp and you do the night walks through the bush and everyone would tell like tales about the drop bears. That was fun. Oh, come on. Harden up. It's not that scary. Spiders are nothing compared to snakes and stuff. And the snakes can be so sweet. All right. Chapter 8. You guys keep chatting. I'll read whatever you say in breaks. In which Sophie leaves the castle in several directions at once. To Sophie's relief, Calcifer blazed up bright and cheerful next morning. If she had not had enough of Howl, she would have been almost touched by how glad Howl was to see Calcifer. I thought she'd done for you, you old ball of gas, Howl said, kneeling at the hearth with his sleeves trailing in the ash. I was only tired, Calcifer said. There was some kind of drag on the castle. I'd never taken it that fast before. Well, don't let her make you do it again. He stood up gracefully, brushing ash off his grey and scarlet suit. Make a start on that spell today, Michael. And if anyone comes from the king, I'm away on urgent private business until tomorrow. I'm going to see Letty, but you needn't tell him that. He picked up his guitar and opened the door with the knob green down onto the wide, cloudy hills. I feel like the beer is like hung up a little. Maybe we should go back to tea next time. The scarecrow was there again. When Howl opened the door, it pitched sideways across him with its turnip face in his chest. The guitar uttered an awful twang. Sophie gave a faint squawk of terror and hung on to the chair. One of the scarecrow's stick arms was scraping stiffly round to get a purchase on the door. From the way Howl's feet were braced, it was clear he was being shoved quite hard. There was no doubt that the thing was determined to get into the castle. Calcifer's blue face leaned out of the grate. Michael stood stock still beyond. There really is a scarecrow, they both said. Oh, is there? Do tell, Hal panted. He got one foot up against the doorframe and heaved. The scarecrow flew lumpishly back to land with a light rustle in the heather some yards off. It sprang up instantly and came hopping toward the castle again. Hal hurriedly laid the guitar on the doorstep and jumped down to meet it. No, you don't, my friend, he said with one hand out. Go back where you came from. He walked forward slowly, still with his hand out. The scarecrow retreated a little, hopping slowly and warily backward. When Hal stopped, the scarecrow stopped too, with its one leg planted in the heather and its ragged arms tilting this way and that like a person sparring for an opening. The rags fluttering on its arms seemed a mad imitation of Hal's sleeves. So you won't go? Hal said, and the turnip head slowly moved from side to side. No. I'm afraid you'll have to, Hal said. You scare Sophie, and there's no knowing what she'll do when she's scared. Come to think of it, you scare me too. Hal's arms moved heavily as if he was lifting a large weight, until they were raised high above his head. He shouted out a strange word which was half hidden in a crack of a sudden thunder, and the scarecrow went soaring away. Up and backward it went, rags fluttering, arms wheeling in protest, up and out, and on, until it was a soaring speck in the sky, then a vanishing point in the clouds, then not to be seen at all. Hal lowered his arms and came back to the doorway, mopping his face on the back of his hand. I take back my hard words, Sophie, he said, panting. That thing was alarming. It may have been dragging the castle back all yesterday. It had some of the strongest magic I've met. Whatever was it, all that was left of the last person you cleaned for. Sophie gave a weak little cackle of laughter. Her heart was behaving badly again. Hal realized something was wrong with her. He jumped indoors across his guitar, took hold of her elbow and sat her in the chair. Take it easy now. Something happened between Howl and Calcifer then. Sophie felt it, because she was being held by Howl, and Calcifer was still leaning out of the grate. Whatever it was, Heart began to behave properly almost at once. Howl looked at Calcifer, shrugged, and turned away to give Michael a whole lot of instructions about making Sophie quiet for the rest of the day. Then he picked up the guitar and left at last. Oh, he does care. Has feelings. As in, like, not a horrible, selfish person. It's not death that frightens me, just how spiders look. Yeah, spiders are kind of ugly sometimes. They can be cute. Oh, I love you, chat. Hype up Magnus Archives. You're here. Yes, this is a beer stream today. Rotate my alcohol out. Maybe next day, Sunday, Wednesday will be wine. Unless we get more whiskey, we'll see. Where was I? Okay. Sophie lay in the chair and pretended to feel twice as ill as she did. She had to let Hal get out of sight. It was a nuisance he was going to upper folding as well, but she would walk so much more slowly, she would arrive around the time he started back. The important thing was not to meet him on the way. She watched Michael slyly while he spread out the spell and scratched his head over it. She waited until he dragged his big leather books off the shelves and began making notes in a frantic, depressed sort of way. When he seemed properly absorbed, Sophie muttered several times, "Stuffy in here." Michael took no notice. "Terribly stuffy," Sophie said, getting up and shambling to the door. "Fresh air." She opened the door and climbed out. Calcifer obligingly stopped the castle dead while she did. Sophie landed in the heather and took a look around to get her bearings. The road over the hills to Upper Folding was a sandy line through the heather just downhill from the castle. Naturally, Calcifer could not make things inconvenient for Howl. Sophie set off toward it. She felt a little sad, going to miss Michael and Calcifer. She was almost at the road when there was shouting behind her. Michael came bounding down the hillside after her, and the tall black castle came bobbing along behind him, getting anxious puffs of smoke from all four turrets. "What are you doing?" Michael said when he caught up. From the way he looked at her, Sophie could see he thought the scarecrow had sent her wrong in the head. "I'm perfectly all right," Sophie said indignantly. "I'm simply going to see my other sister's granddaughter. She's called Letty Hatter too. Now do you understand?" "Where does she live?" Michael demanded, as if he thought Sophie might not know. "Upper Folding," said Sophie. "But that's over 10 miles away," Michael said. "I promised Hal I'd make you rest. I can't let you go. I told him I wouldn't let you out of my sight." Sophie did not look very kindly on this. Hal thought she was useful now because he wanted her to see the king. Of course he did not want her to leave the castle. "Ah," she said. "Besides," said Michael, slowly grasping this situation, "Hal must have gone to Upper Folding too." "I'm quite sure he has," said Sophie. "Then you're anxious about this girl, if she's your great niece," Michael said, arriving at the point at last. "I see, but I can't let you go." "I'm going," said. "But if Hal sees you there, he'll be furious," Michael went on, working things out. "Because I promised him he'll be mad with both of us. Ought to rest." Then, when Sophie was almost ready to hit him, he exclaimed, "Wait! There's a pair of 7-league boots in the broom cupboard." He took Sophie by her skinny old wrist and towed her uphill to the waiting castle. She was forced to give little hops in order not to catch her feet in the heather. "But," she panted, "7 leagues is 21 miles. I'd be halfway to Porthaven in 2 strides." "No, it's 10.5 miles a step," said Michael. "That makes Upper Folding almost exactly. We each take 1 boot and go together, and I won't be letting you out of my sight, and you won't be doing anything strenuous, and we'll get there before Hal does, so he won't even know we've been. That solves all our problems beautifully." Michael was so pleased with himself that Sophie did not have the heart to protest. She shrugged and supposed Michael had better find out about the 2 Lettys before they changed looks again. It was more honest this way. But when Michael fetched the boots from the broom cupboard, Sophie began to have doubts. Up to now, she had thought they were 2 leather buckets that had somehow lost their handles and then got a little squashed. "You're supposed to put your foot in them, shoe and all," Michael explained as he carried the 2 heavy bucket-shaped things to the door. "These are the prototypes of the boots Hal made for the king's army. We managed to get the later ones, a bit lighter and more boot-shaped." He and Sophie sat on the doorstep and each put 1 foot in a boot. "Point yourself toward Upper Folding before you put the boot down," said Michael. He and Sophie stood up on the foot which was in an ordinary shoe and carefully swung themselves round to face Upper Folding. "Now tread," said Michael. Zip! The landscape instantly rushed past them so fast it was only a blur. A grey-green blur for the land and a blue-grey blur for the sky. The wind of their going tore at Sophie's hair and dragged every wrinkle in her face backward until she thought she would arrive with half her face behind each ear. The rushing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Everything was calm and sunny. They were knee-deep in buttercups in the middle of Upper Folding village common. Cow nearby stared at them. Beyond it, thatched cottages drowsed under trees. Unfortunately, bucket-like boot was so heavy that Sophie staggered as she landed. "Don't put that foot down," Michael yelled too late. There was another zipping blur and more rushing wind when it stopped. Sophie found herself right down the folding valley, almost into Marsh Folding. "Oh, drat," she said, and hopped carefully around on her shoe and tried again. Zip, blur, and she was back on Upper Folding Green again, staggering forward with the weight of the boot. She had a glimpse of Michael diving to catch her. Zip, blur. "Oh, bother," wailed Sophie. She was up in the hills again. The crooked black shape of the castle was drifting peacefully nearby. Calcifer was amusing himself blowing black smoke rings from one turret. Sophie saw that much before her shoe caught in the heather, and she stumbled forward again. Zip, zip. This time, Sophie visited in rapid succession the market square of market shipping and the front lawn of a very grand mansion. Blow, she cried. Drat. One word for each place. And she was off again with her own momentum. And another. Zip. Right down at the end of that valley in a field somewhere. A large red bull raised its ring nose from the grass and thoughtfully lowered its horns. I'm just leaving, my good beast, Sophie cried, hopping herself around frantically. Zip. Back to the mansion. Zip. Market square. Zip. And there was the castle yet again. She was getting the hang of it. Zip. He was up a folding, but how did you stop? Zip. Oh, confound it, Sophie cried, almost in marsh folding again. This time, she hopped round very carefully and trod with great deliberation. Zip. Unfortunately, the boot landed in a cow pat and she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up before Sophie could move and dragged the boot off her foot. Thank you, Sophie cried breathlessly. There seems no reason why I should ever stop. He's so cute. And also, that does sound amazing. Imagine having boots that you push wherever. How many Aussie bucks would it cost me to have you narrate the Wheel of Time series? Oh my dude, that is a long series. It's really good, but like, I would have to get like a proper salary for something like. I actually really want to do a reread because I read it in high school. Um, and I don't remember. I don't remember like large chunks. And Robert Jordan passed away before um I was able to finish. And then I didn't know who Brandon Sanderson was at the time. So I just didn't finish it. But now I need to reread it so I can get to Brandon. Love Brandon Sanderson. Wonderful. Scribble 58. How much? I don't know. How much is a narrator's salary? Someone Google it for me. I've lost where I was up to. Okay. So Sophie's heart pounded a bit as they walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house, but only in the way hearts do when you have done a lot rather quickly. She felt very grateful for whatever Howl and Calcifer had done. Nice place, Michael remarked as he hid the boots in Mrs. Fairfax's hedge. Sophie agreed. The house was the biggest in the village. It was thatched with white walls between the black beams, and as Sophie remembered from visits as a child, you walked up to the porch, through a garden crowded with flowers and humming with bees. Over the porch, a honeysuckle and a white climbing rose were competing as to which give most work to the bees. It was a perfect hot summer morning down here in Upper Folding. Mrs. Fairfax answered the door herself. She was one of those plump, comfortable ladies, swathes of butter-colored hair coiled round her head, who made you feel good with life just to look at her. Sophie felt just the tiniest bit envious of Letty. Mrs. Fairfax looked from Sophie to Michael. She had seen Sophie last a year ago as a girl of 17, and there was no reason for her to recognize her as an old woman of 90. Good morning to you, she said politely. Sophie sighed. Michael said, This is Letty Hatter's great aunt. I brought her here to see Letty. Oh, I thought the face looked familiar, Mrs. Fairfax exclaimed. There's quite a family likeness. Do come in. Letty's a little bit busy just now, but have some scones and honey while you wait. She opened her front door wider. Instantly, a large collie dog squeezed past Mrs. Fairfax's skirts, barged between Sophie and Michael, and ran across the nearest flower bed, snapping off flowers right and left. Oh, stop him, Mrs. Fairfax gasped, flying off in pursuit. I don't want him out just now. There was a minute or so of helter-skelter chase, in which the dog ran hither and thither, whining in a disturbed way, and Mrs. Fairfax and Sophie ran after the dog, jumping flower beds and getting in one another's way, and Michael ran after Sophie, crying, Stop! You'll make yourself ill! Then the dog set off loping round one corner of the house. Michael realized that the way to stop Sophie was to stop the dog. He made a crosswise dash through the flower beds, plunged round the house after the dog, and seized it by two handfuls of its thick coat just as it reached the orchard at the back. Sophie hobbled up to find Michael pulling the dog away backward and making such strange faces at her that she thought at first he was ill. But he jerked his head so often toward the orchard that she realized he was only trying to tell her something. She stuck her face round the corner of the house, expecting to see a swarm of bees. Hal was there with Letty. They were in a grove of mossy apple trees in full bloom, with a row of beehives in the distance. Letty sat in a white garden seat. Hal was kneeling on one knee in the grass at her feet, holding one of her hands and looking noble and ardent. Letty was smiling lovingly at him. But the worst of it, as far as Sophie was concerned, was that Letty did not look like Martha at all. She was her own extremely beautiful self. She was wearing a dress of the same kind of pinks and white as the crowded apple blossom overhead. Her dark hair trailed in glossy curls over one shoulder, and her eyes shone with devotion for Hal. Sophie brought her head back round the corner and looked with dismay at Michael holding the whining collie dog. He must have had a speed spell with him, Michael whispered, equally dismayed. Mrs. Fairfax caught them up, panting and trying to pin back a loose coil of her buttery hair. Bad dog, she said in a fierce whisper to the collie. I'll put a spell on you if you do that once more. The dog blinked and crouched down. Mrs. Fairfax pointed a stern finger. Into the house. Stay in the house. The collie shook himself free of Michael's hands and slunk away around the house again. Thank you so much, Mrs. Fairfax said to Michael. They all followed it. He will keep trying to bite Letty's visitor. Inside, he shouted sternly in the front garden. The collie seemed to be thinking of going round the house and getting to the orchard the other way. The dog gave her a woeful look over its shoulder and crawled dismally indoors through the porch. That dog has it right. Howl deserves a good bite. Is words I cannot say on. The dog may have the right idea, Sophie said. Mrs. Fairfax, do you know who Letty's visitor is? Mrs. Fairfax chuckled. The wizard Pendragon, or Howl, or whatever he calls himself, she said. But Letty and I don't let on we know. It amused me when he first turned up, calling himself Sylvester Oak, because I could see he'd forgotten me, though I hadn't forgotten him, even though his hair used to be black in his student days. Mrs. Fairfax by now had her hands folded in front of her and was standing bolt upright, prepared to talk all day, as Sophie had often seen her do before. He was my old tutor's very last pupil, you know. Before she retired, when Mr. Fairfax was alive, he used to like me to transport us both to Kingsbury to see a show from time to time. I can manage two very nicely if I take it slowly, and I always used to drop in on old Mrs. Penstamen while I was there. She liked her old pupils to keep in touch, and one time he introduced this young Hal to us. Oh, she was proud of him. He taught Wizard Solomon too, you know, and she said Hal was twice as good. But don't you know the reputation Hal has? Michael interrupted. Getting into Miss Fairfax's conversation was rather like getting into a turning skipping rope. You had to choose the exact moment. But once you were in, you were in. Mrs. Fairfax turned herself slightly to face Michael. Most of it's just talk to your... Most of it's just talk to my mind, she said. Michael opened his mouth to say that it was not, But he was in the skipping rope then, and it went on turning. And I said to Letty, "Here's your big chance, my love." I knew Hal could teach her 20 times more than I could. For I don't mind telling you, Letty's brains go way beyond mine, and she could end up in the same league as the Witch of the Waste, only in a good way. Letty's a good girl, and I'm fond of her. If Mrs. Penstamen was still teaching, I'd have Letty to her tomorrow. But she isn't. So I said, "Letty, here's Wizard Howl courting you, and you could do worse than fall in love with him yourself and let him be your teacher. The pair of you will go far." I don't think Letty was too keen on the idea at first, but she's been softening lately, and today it seems to be going beautifully. Here, Mrs. Fairfax paused to beam benevolently at Michael, and Sophie dashed into the skipping rope for her turn. "But someone told me Letty was fond of someone else," said. "Sorry for him, you mean," said Mrs. Fairfax. She lowered her voice. There's a terrible disability there," she whispered suggestively, "and it's asking too much of any girl. I told him so. I'm sorry for him myself." Sophie managed a mystified, "Oh?" But it's a fearsomely strong spell. It's very sad," Fairfax wound on. "I had to tell him that there's no way someone of my abilities can break anything that's put on by the Witch of the Waste. Hal might, but of course, he can't ask Hal, can he?" Here, Michael, who kept looking nervously to the corner of the house in case Hal came round it and discovered them, managed to trample through the skipping rope and stop it by saying, "I think we'd better be going." "Are you sure you won't come in for a taste of my honey?" asked Mrs. Fairfax. "I use it in nearly all my spells, you know." And she was off again, this time about the magical properties of honey. Michael and Sophie walked purposefully down the path to the gate, and Mrs. Fairfax drifted behind them, talking away and sorrowfully straightening plants that the dog had bent as she talked. Sophie, meanwhile, racked her brains for a way to find out how Mrs. Fairfax knew Letty was Letty, without upsetting Michael. Mrs. Fairfax paused to gasp a bit. She heaved a large lupine upright. Sophie took the plunge. "Mrs. Fairfax, wasn't it my niece Martha who was supposed to come to you?" "Naughty girls," Mrs. Fairfax said, smiling and shaking her head as she emerged from the lupine. "As if I wouldn't recognize one of my own honey-based spells. But as I said to her at the time, I'm not one to keep anyone against their will, and I'd always rather teach someone who wants to learn. Only, I said to her, I'll have no pretense here. You stay as your own self or not at all. And it's worked out very happily, as you see. Are you sure you won't stay and ask for her for yourself?" "I think we'd better go," Sophie said. "We have to get back," Michael added, with another nervous look toward the orchard. He collected the 7-league boots from the hedge and set one down outside the gate for Sophie. "And I'm going to hold on to you this time," he said. Mrs. Fairfax leaned over her gate while Sophie inserted her foot in the boot. 7 leaguers, she said. "Would you believe I've not seen any of those for years? Very useful things for someone your age, Mrs. I wouldn't mind a pair myself these days. So it's you Letty inherits her witchcraft from, is it? Not that it necessarily runs in families, but as often as not." Michael took hold of Sophie's arm and pulled. Both boots came down, and the rest of Mrs. Fairfax's talk ended in the zip and rush of air. Next moment, Michael had to brace his feet in order not to collide with the castle. The door was open. Inside, Pulsifer was roaring. "Porthaven door! Someone's been banging on it ever since you left." And that is 2 chapters. So we are up to chapter 9. And we did it perfectly. We did it in the hour. So go us. Yeah, but 50 per hour apparently. Oh, we're talking about the narration chart. Mm. Senor Chicken, it's almost 1 p.m. here. I guess I'm going back to sleep. I mean, sure. If it helps you sleep. Oh, Sammy, you're here. Honey is dope. Magic honey, especially so. So we will be back again to read chapter 9 and 10 on Wednesday. And for any of you who missed the start or have missed any of the other chapters, I think all the other videos are still up on my page. If not, they're going on my YouTube. The first one is up, and I am going to put them up tomorrow. And they'll all just go up a week after each live stream. What was that, Meg? Honey is amazing. Honey and raw bees, honeycomb, straight is the best. I have never had raw honey in my life. Do you keep bees too? Meg does everything. Ah, okay. That is the end of the stream. Last stream we chatted about the live action movie, like if we would make who we would like cast in that. I'm a good reader. Thank you, Doom Yeti. So there seems to be a few new people today. And oh, vegan life here. I respect it. I wish I live in it. Oh. Well, I don't know, Meg. I'm sorry. Next time you move into a proper house, you can like keep bees again. As I was saying, I don't remember what I was saying. maybe drinking throughout the stream isn't the best idea. Am I crying or am I high? I'm neither. I'm just glittery. I have highlighter on. We should probably end the stream now because now we're just like talking for no reason. You're gonna have one of those glass ones in your house? A beehive? A glass? I don't know much about bees. Oh yeah, we were talking about the live action Howl's Moving Castle. That is what we were talking about. Yeah, so live action Howl's Moving Castle. We were like talking about cast members who we wanted to be in it. I can't remember exactly who we decided, but I know Florence Pugh as Sophie, and I think that's all we really need to do. I need a sleep. Not just yet. It's only 9 o'clock here. I've got a Zoom call to get to. A couple of people who will be waiting. Hang out. But we'll be back Wednesday at the same time. So 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Betty White is Sophie. That's old Sophie. So you need the old Sophie and then you need the young Sophie. But Betty White as old Sophie would be hilarious. I that would be interesting. She's got the right amount of sass. Sophie is very sassy. I also like as we're reading this, anyone who hasn't read it before is seeing that Howl is actually quite horrible. Like he's really a bit of a dick. In the film, he's just kind of like brooding, and I don't know, just pretty and brooding. He is in the film. Like he's fun. I do love like movie, but I enjoy how much of a like a heartless brat he is in this, and he's just like occasionally he's like, yeah, I have emotions and I care about my demon fire and the old lady who cleans my house, but only because she's of use to me. Um, and I like how that develops. I really enjoy. I'm looking forward to showing you guys that. Although it has been quite a long time since I read it, Um, I'm enjoying relearning it too. And we have gotten how far have we gotten? We've done quite a bit. Okay. Well, we've gone overtime. It was really nice hanging out. Um, I will see you Wednesday. Bye.